The strange death of Natica Reeves. Natica Reeves was a Gilded Age daughter, adopted by her stepfather after being ignored by her father, banker Alva Belmont, her entire life. She died under strange circumstances in 1908. You can learn more about the Zionist Belmont family and their attempt to destroy William Randolph Hearst on this channel. Natica was adopted by her stepfather, United States Assistant Secretary of State George Lockhart Rives, when her mother married him in 1889, as her father, Oliver Belmont, chased Alva Erskine Smith Vanderbilt, eventually marrying her in 1896 at the age of 38, when Natica was 13 and Alva was 43. Alva Vanderbilt was actually the ex-wife of one of Belmont's best friends, William Vanderbilt, but that did not stop him. Belmont cared little for his daughter Natica. Years prior, in 1882, without his parents' consent, 24-year-old Oliver Belmont proposed marriage to debutante Sarah Swan Whiting, a popular and beautiful socialite with a strong connection to the Astors. His parents, August and Caroline Belmont, objected to the engagement, thinking Oliver was not mature enough for marriage because of his gambling and playboy lifestyle. As a result, he was sent to Bremen, Germany, to learn the banking trade from the Rothschild family, where his father had been trained. Oliver became dissipated and developed a penchant for absinthe. When Mrs. Belmont realized his decline, she finally agreed to the marriage, wanting to wash her hands of her son. Oliver Belmont married Sarah Swan Whiting in Newport, Rhode Island, on December 27, 1882, at her family home, Swanhurst. The Whiting family, Judge Swan of the State Supreme Court of Ohio, summered in Newport, Rhode Island, and was one of the first to build a cottage on Aquidneck Island, and so was able to capitalize on the socialization of the nouveau riche in Newport. His daughter married Augustus Whiting, and they raised 4 children in Newport, just as it was becoming the resort of the rich and powerful set of the Gilded Age. Swanhurst Gatehouse sold for $3 million alone a few years ago, and the Swanhurst Mansion was sold in 2013. The newlywed Belmonts traveled to Paris for their honeymoon, where they were joined several weeks later by Sarah's mother and her 2 older sisters, perhaps out of concern for Oliver's behavior. Oliver, having originally agreed to the visit, now objected. He took to frequenting gambling houses and brothels, drinking absinthe to escape the situation. His personality was affected by the absinthe, and he had a violent and abusive argument with his new wife, leaving her terrified. He abandoned her in Paris and was later seen in Bordeaux, traveling with a French dancer. Ashamed and heartbroken, Sarah and the Whiting family returned to America. In April 1882, Sarah realized she was pregnant with Oliver's child, but the two divorced the same year they were married in 1882, and he was prevented from seeing the child. The Whiting family certainly had help with prominent judges, and while divorce was seriously frowned upon, it occurred often in the Gilded Age set. As an aside, Sarah Swan Whiting is a very beautiful woman, and you can see her pouting lips in various photographs. It's clear that Caucasian women included these features throughout time. Natica Caroline Belmont, born in 1883, was born in September 5th to be exact. She was named for her mother's friend, Lady Natica Lister Keyes. Her mother was also friends with Edith Wharton and the Mrs. Caroline Astor, who acted as godmother to the baby. Despite this, Oliver disowned Natica, claiming that she was not his daughter and not a Belmont. Sarah remarried, and Natica was adopted by her stepfather, the former Assistant Secretary of State, George Lockhart Rives, and she took his last name, which was uncommon at the time. Rives' first wife, Caroline Morris Keene, had died in 1887. Natica was on her way to becoming a prominent New York socialite. Natica Caroline Reeves. The Caroline was named for Oliver's mother to assert parentage, and she matured into a popular young lady. She was often the subject of newspaper articles in both New York and Newport, in part because she was often in the company of an Astor or a Vanderbilt, and the fact that she was Oliver Belmont's daughter was commonly known, but it did not make her popular. She and her parents were part of Mrs. Astor's 400, and newspapers around the country fed the average citizen's curiosity with stories of young debutantes' activities, fashion, and friends. Natica's closest friend was Cynthia Roche, whose family owned the Elm Court estate on Bellevue Avenue. Cynthia began seeing Arthur S. Burden, whose family owned the Burden Iron Works of Troy, New York, and who had married into the industrialist Scottish Abercrombie family. The Burden Iron Works sprang to fame by making horseshoes en masse, and once housed the Burden water wheel, the most powerful vertical water wheel in history. It is now a museum and open to the public. This is part of a long line of American industry being shelved for Indian or Chinese industry, which is fraught with child labor, poor quality, and environmental issues. The idea that you need some big invention to be successful is total nonsense. The Burdens dominated New York with horseshoes. Burden's brother William often accompanied him when he called on Cynthia Roche, and soon William Burden and Natica Reeves were seeing each other. After Cynthia Roche and Arthur Burden married in 1906, Natica felt increasing pressure to marry William Burden, and she became ill. She decided to take a rest cure at the sprawling Lakewood Hotel in New Jersey, according to the New Yorker, seeking treatment for a condition she called New Yorkitis. New Jersey was experiencing a renaissance of spa towns and remains a destination for beach lovers today. The cure for New Yorkitis was hydrotherapy, dunking your body in a bubbling hot spring or in a hot tub full of salts and herbs. Was she overwhelmed with the births of her 2 new step-siblings, which occurred when she was 7 years old? Was Natica being harassed around the circumstances of her birth and the marriage into this very successful industrialist Burden family? Or was Natica feeling the strain from construction at her mother and stepfather's home? In 1906, her stepfather purchased all 3 65, 67, and 69 East 79th Street in Manhattan, with the intention of building in their place a single grand home. Reeves was well known in New York and across the nation. A lawyer, he had risen to Assistant Secretary of State under President Grover Cleveland and served as Corporation Counsel to the City of New York. He was president of the board of the New York Public Library, president of the Board of Governors of New York Hospital, a director of the Metropolitan Opera House, a trustee of Columbia University, and held many other offices. 2 years after the death of his first wife in 1887, he had married Sarah Whiting Belmont. Sarah, known as Sally, had been married to the fabulously wealthy and socially important Oliver Belmont for less than a year. The New York Times would later recount the match was not a happy one. Shortly after Sally gave birth to a daughter, Natica, she divorced Belmont and married Reeves. The esteemed architectural firm of Carrere and Hastings produced a French Baroque mansion seemingly plucked from the Place Vendôme. Although toned down in terms of ornamentation, the overall feel of the limestone 17th century architecture was evident. Ground was broken in 1907, and the imposing home was completed a year later. The first floor was directly at sidewalk level with 3 arched openings, 2 doors flanking a central window. To preclude any unnecessary mixing with servants, the entrance to the right, marked number 69, was the family entrance that led to a vestibule into the main house. The matching door at number 67 on the opposite side accessed the servants' area below ground. The second and third floors featured 4 shallow pilasters. Here, the tall, floor-to-ceiling second-floor windows were capped by enclosed pediments. The windows poured sunlight into the library, which extended the width of the house. As I'm sure many of you know, books need light to prevent molding and other issues. Above the 4th floor, a mansard roof finished the Parisian effect. The year that construction began, the Reeves announced the engagement of Sally's daughter Natica to William P. Burden. William is sometimes marked as Williams P. Burden. Not only was this a match of two excessively wealthy families, it was one of the most socially important pairings of the year. Overriding the socially uncomfortable issue of her parents having divorced was Natica's pedigree. Not only was she the granddaughter of Caroline Slidell Perry Belmont, who was nearly revered by New York society for imposing strict etiquette rules, but her godmother was Caroline Astor. The Times praised Natica as a very beautiful girl. She is clever and vivacious and has been a great belle. In fact, few women in New York society have been more admired. The Reeves had summer homes in Newport and Tuxedo, although as Natica had matured, they spent less time in Rhode Island. Miss Reeves, said the Times, since the year of her debut, although classed with the Newport set, has seldom passed a summer at that resort, as Mrs. Reeves did not approve of the social atmosphere of the city by the sea for young girls. Was Natica being bullied? As their Grace Church wedding approached, Sally Reeves arranged rooms at the Hotel Netherland for Natica, along with a trained nurse, to combat prenuptial nerves. It was deemed best by Mrs. Reeves that her daughter should be away from the confusion incident to the wedding preparations, which Mrs. Reeves attended to in detail, reported the Times. So it appears Natica continued her nervous disposition to need so much preparation. The Reeves house was the scene of glittering dances and dinners for 8 years. Then, in May of 1916, George Reeves became ill. A month later, doctors Charles Easton and Austin Flint were summoned from the city to Swanhurst, the Newport mansion on Bellevue Avenue belonging to George's wife, while the family gathered. Reeves survived this health scare, but he remained unhealthy. A year later, in April 1917, he was too ill to walk his daughter Mildred down the aisle in the Whiting Chapel of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Reeves and Sally had built the chapel as a memorial to her parents. A subdued breakfast for the bridal party and families followed the wedding at the Reeves mansion. 3 weeks later, on May 1st, Mildred's brother, F. Bayard Reeves, was married in the same chapel to Helen Lee Hunt. 3 months later, in August, their father died at the Newport home, Swanhurst. The New York Times was compelled to write an editorial saying the death of a citizen so active for many years in many fields of public endeavor as George Lockhart Reeves compels a note of comment. Shortly afterwards, in memory of her husband, Sarah Whiting Reeves donated a set of granite steps designed by the late dramatic Stanford White to the campus of Columbia University leading to the South Field. Back in 1907, William Burden visited Natica many times to press his suit for marriage, and finally Mrs. Sarah Reeves consented to the marriage. The ceremony at the Reeves Mansion, now known as the Reeves-Jerry Mansion, was small. The couple left for their honeymoon in July of 1907. When they returned 6 months later, they moved into Burden's mother's home on 808 Fifth Avenue in New York, right across the street from Central Park. This was not ideal. Were there money problems? Other members of Natica's set were building their own homes in New York and Newport. Burden's mother appeared to be in fine health and lived until the age of 83. She died in 1920 in Troy, New York, so maybe she lent the home to her newlyweds as she went upstate. Burden's brother, James Abercrombie Burden Jr., appears to have been the most successful of the brothers due to his work on Burden Iron Works. He married Alva Vanderbilt's sister-in-law, Florence Adele Vanderbilt, who was 2 years his junior sometime after her divorce in 1910. So relations with the Vanderbilt family had been on the up and up for the Burdens throughout the 1900s as the Astors sort of faded into the background. Could Natica's father, Oliver Belmont, have pressured his second wife, Alva, for an heir and had been upset that Natica was his only heir? Alva Vanderbilt had 3 children by her first marriage, Consuelo Vanderbilt, William Kissam Vanderbilt II, and Harold Sterling Vanderbilt. She was in her 40s, but may have shaved a few years off her age, as many women did, including Natica. Alva Vanderbilt shocked society in March 1895 when she divorced her husband William, who had long been unfaithful, at a time when divorce was rare among the elite. She received a large financial settlement said to be in excess of $10 million at the time, in the hundreds of millions of dollars today, in addition to several estates. She already owned Marble House outright. The grounds for divorce were allegations of William's adultery, although there were some who believed William had hired a woman to pretend to be his scene mistress so that Alva would finally divorce him. Alva was a violent woman. She once threatened to shoot her daughter's lover since he didn't live up to her standards. She beat boys up throughout her childhood in the South for teasing her for being a girl. Alva Vanderbilt's arch-rival in society was Mrs. Astor, and so the fact that her stepdaughter Natica was Mrs. Astor's goddaughter likely caused strife. Oliver and Alva would spend time in Belmont's home, Belcourt Castle, in Newport. After Oliver died in 1908, Alva took up the cause of women's suffrage, again becoming violent and passionate about it, marching publicly. She is interred with Oliver Belmont, her second husband, in the Belmont Mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, for which artist Helen Maitland Armstrong designed a set of Renaissance-inspired painted glass windows. According to the New York Times, on February 21st, 1908, Mrs. William Prout Burden, who was Natica Reeves and a society belle of New York, Newport, and Washington, was found dead in her bed at her Fifth Avenue home. She was 25 years old. Death, the coroner decided, was accidental and due to gas poisoning. A disconnected gas tube, which had led from a chandelier to a drop light, so placed that she might read while propped up in bed, had permitted a flow of gas which filled the room. Where was William? Where were the servants? Mrs. Burden was 22 years old, actually 25, and since her marriage on April 17, 1907, she and her husband had occupied the beautiful home of the latter's father, where her mother-in-law still lived, the late James Abercrombie Burden at 808 Fifth Avenue. The discovery of her death threw the household into confusion, and when the facts became generally known, it created a sensation in the social set. Burden had spent the night in another part of the house and learned of his wife's death from the servants who had entered her room at 10 o'clock that morning. Coming home at 11 o'clock the previous night, Burden noticed that a light was still burning in his wife's room and passing the door called out good night. Mrs. Burden responded in a tone that indicated that she was in her usual health and spirits, but Burden never saw his wife, and it's not clear what he was doing out so late the night before. Passing through the hall on her way to Mrs. Burden's room on the second floor, the maid smelled gas, and hastily entered the chamber found her mistress dead. The room was filled with gas, although a window was open several inches from the bottom. The fumes were pouring from the rubber tubing directly into the dead woman's face. Mrs. Burden's physicians were summoned, and they in turn notified the coroner. The latter's investigation showed that the gas tube had been disconnected from the lamp, which individuals could do for their own purposes. Having grown drowsy, perhaps, Mrs. Burden had reached from her bed and turned off the lamp cock instead of taking the trouble to get up and shut off the gas at the chandelier jet. The dead woman lay as in sleep without a sign of physical or mental disturbance. Near the open window to which he had crawled and almost dead from gas was Mrs. Burden's little pet, a white Pomeranian terrier, which had been permitted to sleep in the room. Mrs. Burden, as we know, was the daughter of the first Mrs. Oliver Hazard Payne Belmont, who was Miss Sally Whiting Reeves, who obtained a divorce in 1882. She retained custody of the child and afterward married George L. Reeves, at one time Corporation Counsel of the City of New York. A note followed that Natica Burden was pregnant at the time of her death. This child would have thrown the Belmont line into confusion and would likely have been a huge burden to Oliver Belmont, who left his fortune to his new wife Alva and her suffragette activities. There is also this note from the New York Advertiser from February 22nd, 1908. An inquest is to be held to inquire into the cause of the mysterious death of Mrs. William P. Burden. She was the lovely Natica Reeves, whose body was found yesterday in her bedroom. No autopsy will be held, as the coroner is convinced that death was due to gas asphyxiation. Whether the beautiful young matron died through accident or with deliberate intent is a matter which the coroner wishes to solve. At present, the evidence points towards accident, but there are circumstances which give color to a possible suicide. For 1 year past, Mrs. Burden has received many anonymous letters, scurrilous in nature and bitterly attacking her, rumored to be from former help. One has to remember that Irish servants had a very difficult time in New York at the time and were subject to all kinds of assault and abuse, and this often caused such incredible reactions, including public riots. As a result, Mrs. Burden suffered a nervous breakdown, which we know would not have been her first. Mrs. Burden's bedroom is a large and roomy one on the 3rd floor of the Burden mansion at 808 Fifth Avenue. She complained that the light in the room was bad and had a reading lamp attached to a jet over her bed. The lamp sat on a table and a rubber tube supplied the gas from the wall jet. She spent Thursday evening in bed reading a novel. The next morning, the maid called to awaken her, but there was no answer. No odor of gas had been noticed in the hall. When the maid opened the door, she was met with a rush of gas. Taking one frightened look at her mistress, who was lying in a peaceful position with her head resting on her arm, the girl rushed to the breakfast room. "Come to the madam, quick," she cried to Mr. Burden, who was just finishing breakfast. Mr. Burden reached his wife's room and threw open windows, which form a bay looking out on 72nd Street. He hurried to the bed and tried to arouse her. "She's not dead," he cried. "See, her body's still warm. Send for Dr. Lyle." Dr. Lyle was the first physician to reach the house, but he told the husband that the young woman was dead. She was 22 years old, and we know she was actually 25. Her funeral was attended by many members of New York society, including Natica's biological father. He would die a few months later in June 1908, supposedly from appendicitis. After the ceremony, Natica's body was taken by train to the Burden family plot in Troy, New York for burial. Her mother died in 1924 and dedicated her life to her 2 other children she had with Reeves, Frances Bayard Reeves, born in 1890 and dying in 1969, and Mildred Reeves Godwin, born in 1893 and 1927. William Burden, for his part, never remarried. From the New York Times, April 14, 1907. The wedding of 23-year-old Miss Natica Reeves and 30-year-old William Proudfoot Burden will take place on Wednesday at Grace Church Chantry. The bride is one of the most beautiful girls in the fashionable set and is descended from a long line of beautiful women. She is the goddaughter of Mrs. Astor and was born at Newport. There will be no bridesmaids. The bridegroom's brother, the husband of Natica's friend Cynthia, will be best man. The invitations are limited as the Burden family is in mourning. It's not clear what they were in mourning for and if this was an attempted cover for Natica's nervousness and lack of invites. There will be a small reception for relatives after the ceremony at the residence of Mr. and Mrs. George L. Reeves. This was the Reeves mansion. Mr. and Mrs. Burden, after a short wedding trip, will go abroad for the summer. Burden died in 1943 in his beloved Rhode Island at the age of 66 and was buried alongside his wife in the Troy, New York Burden Mausoleum. He appears to have never remarried, and we have never gotten to the bottom of what really happened to Natica Reeves that night.